The year is 1609, and along the eastern edge of an unmapped continent, a river cuts through dense woodland toward the sea. European eyes have not yet named these waters, these forests, these shores where the Lenape people have lived for generations beyond counting. But change arrives with the turning tide, carried on wooden ships that will transform this landscape forever. When Henry Hudson's vessel entered the river that would bear his name, he opened a corridor between two worlds. The wooded banks, thick with oak and chestnut, concealed possibilities that Dutch merchants would soon recognize. Here was a natural harbor, deep and protected. Here was access to the interior, to furs and trade routes that stretched into territories the Europeans could barely imagine. Here, at the meeting point of river and ocean, a new kind of settlement would take root. The island the Lenape called Mannahatta was a place of hills and marshes, of clear streams flowing through old-growth forest. The southern tip, where the island narrowed toward the harbor, offered the firmest ground, the clearest sight lines across the water. It was there that the Dutch would plant their flag and their fortunes in 1626. Dutch officials concluded an exchange with the Lenape, securing Manhattan through a transaction of trade goods whose precise nature has been obscured by time. What remains certain is the outcome. The Dutch claimed possession of the island, and with that claim came the will to transform wilderness into settlement. The colony they envisioned would serve as an anchor for the Dutch West India Company's ambitions in the New World. The work of building began immediately. Trees that had stood for centuries fell to Dutch axes. The cleared land revealed the contours of the future city, and upon that raw earth, settlers raised their first structures. Timber frames rose against the sky. The forest that had covered the island began its retreat, pushed back by the determination of men and women who measured progress in acres cleared, in buildings raised. Those early structures were humble, born of necessity rather than ambition. Single-room dwellings housed entire families. The air inside smelled of smoke from cooking fires, of damp wool, of the bodies of people living close together through long winters. Mothers ground grain while children tended to daily tasks. Life followed rhythms dictated by daylight and season, by the demands of survival in a place still half wild. Fort Amsterdam rose at the southern tip of Manhattan in 1626, a statement rendered in timber and earth. The palisade walls, though rough, declared Dutch presence and Dutch resolve. From within those walls, the colony's administrators oversaw trade, resolved disputes, and attempted to impose order on a settlement that attracted traders, farmers, craftsmen, and adventurers in equal measure. The settlement the Dutch called New Amsterdam grew slowly at first, spreading north from the fort in irregular patterns. Streets followed old paths and property lines. Buildings clustered near the waterfront where ships arrived with supplies from across the Atlantic and departed laden with furs bound for European markets. Yet the colony's growth was shadowed by conflict. The relationship between Dutch settlers and the Lenape nations deteriorated through misunderstanding and broken agreements. Violence erupted periodically, raids and reprisals that left both sides blooded. By 1644, Dutch leaders and native representatives negotiated a series of treaties meant to establish boundaries and prevent further bloodshed. The peace was fragile, but it gave New Amsterdam breathing room to consolidate and grow as the colony stabilized. Its economy became increasingly dependent on a labor force that arrived in chains. In 1655, the number of enslaved Africans in New Amsterdam increased significantly. These men and women worked the docks where ships loaded and unloaded their cargoes. They labored in the fields that surrounded the settlement. They performed household tasks in the homes of the colony's more prosperous residents. Their forced labor became woven into the fabric of daily life, an essential component of the colony's economic foundation. The homes of New Amsterdam bore the architectural stamp of the Low Countries. Steep gabled roofs crowned buildings constructed of brick and timber. Small windows with diamond-paned glass let in modest amounts of light. Interiors remained dark and close, spaces where families gathered around tables for meals of bread, cheese, and salted meat. Along the waterfront, warehouses stored the goods that justified the colony's existence. Beaver pelts, stacked and bundled, awaited shipment to Amsterdam where they would be transformed into felt hats. Barrels of salted fish stood ready for loading. The smell of tar and rope and salt water pervaded the docks, mingling with the shouts of sailors and the creak of ships straining against their moorings. The settlement's northern boundary was marked by a defensive wall, a wooden palisade built to protect against potential attacks. The wall stretched across the island from the East River to the Hudson, a barrier that defined where the city ended and the wilderness began. But the Dutch hold on New Amsterdam was never as secure as the settlers might have hoped. England had its own ambitions in North America, and the gap where New Netherland sat, splitting the English colonies, became increasingly intolerable to English strategic thinking. In 1664, the reckoning came. English warships entered the harbour on a late summer day, their guns run out, their intent unmistakable. The Dutch garrison faced a choice: fight against overwhelming force or surrender. Director General Peter Stuyvesant wanted to resist, but the colonists he governed were less certain. Many were not Dutch by birth. Commercial interests transcended national loyalty. Without a shot fired, the English took possession of New Amsterdam and promptly renamed it for the Duke of York. Brother to King Charles II, the transition from Dutch to English control was less dramatic than might be expected. English authorities recognized that disrupting established trade networks would serve no useful purpose. Dutch merchants continued their business. Dutch families remained in their homes. The language of the streets remained predominantly Dutch for years after the formal transfer of power. What changed was the ultimate authority, the flag that flew over the fort, the direction in which taxes and revenues flowed. The Treaty of Breda in 1667 formalized what force had already accomplished. The Dutch Republic ceded New Netherland to England, accepting the loss in exchange for territorial concessions elsewhere. Yet the story included one brief reversal. In 1673, during another war between England and the Dutch Republic, Dutch naval forces recaptured the city. For 1 year, it bore the name New Orange. But diplomacy again determined the city's fate, and by 1674, it had returned to English hands, this time for good. Under English rule, the city that had been New Amsterdam entered a new phase of growth. The population, which had numbered perhaps 1,500 at the time of the English takeover, began to climb. By 1680, more than 4,000 people called New York home. The city spread northward from its original core, new streets platted, new buildings rising on land that had recently been farm or forest. The architecture began to reflect the city's dual heritage. The old Dutch Stad Huys, a substantial brick building dating from the Dutch period, continued to serve as City Hall, a reminder of the colony's origins even as English officials now directed its affairs. New construction increasingly showed English influences, yet the steep gables and brick facades of Dutch design remained common. Walking the streets of New York meant moving through a visual catalogue of cultural blending. The waterfront dominated the city's economy and shaped its geography. The Great Dock, completed in 1679, extended into the East River, providing berths for the ships that connected New York to the wider Atlantic world. Vessels arrived from England carrying manufactured goods, cloth and tools and luxury items. They departed laden with timber, furs, and agricultural products. The dock was perpetual motion, sailors hauling cargo, merchants inspecting shipments, customs officials recording transactions. Streets like Pearl Street, tracing the old shoreline, became arteries of commerce and daily life. Traders operated from ground floor shops, displaying their wares to passers-by. Craftsmen worked in attached workshops, the sounds of their labor, the strike of hammer on anvil, the rasp of saw through wood, forming the soundtrack of urban life. Sailors on leave sought entertainment in taverns where beer flowed and news from distant ports circulated. The city's social structure reflected the hierarchies common to all colonial societies. At the top stood the merchant elite, men who controlled trade networks and held positions of civic authority. Below them were artisans and shopkeepers. Further down came laborers and servants. And at the bottom of the social order were the enslaved. Their numbers grew substantially during the English period, their labor exploited in households, businesses, and the nascent industrial operations the growing city required. The late 1680s brought uncertainty to New York, a reflection of turmoil across the Atlantic. When James II was deposed in England's Glorious Revolution, the colonial government faced a crisis of legitimacy. In this vacuum, a militia officer named Jacob Leisler emerged as a leader of those opposed to the existing colonial administration. His faction seized control in 1689, but when royal troops finally arrived in 1691, Leisler was arrested, tried, and executed. The episode left divisions that would persist in the city's political life. Through all these upheavals, the city continued its transformation. The old defensive wall fell into disrepair as the city expanded beyond it, but the line it had traced remained significant. The street that ran along its former course would become one of the city's most important thoroughfares. Wall Street, by the end of the 17th century, New York had established itself as a vital node in the Atlantic trading network. It was no longer a frontier outpost but a true city, cosmopolitan in character, with a population drawn from multiple nations. Dutch, English, French Huguenots, Germans, Africans, and others created a cultural diversity that distinguished New York from more homogeneous settlements elsewhere in colonial America. The physical city bore witness to its growth. Brick buildings, substantial and permanent, replaced the wooden structures of earlier decades. Churches served multiple denominations. Markets bustled with activity as farmers from the surrounding countryside brought their produce to sell. The city's footprint expanded steadily northward and along both waterfronts. Yet for all its growth and prosperity, New York remained a place of stark contrasts. Wealth concentrated in the hands of a few while many labored in poverty. The enslaved population endured conditions of profound injustice. Relations with the native peoples whose land this had been remained fraught. The city's success was built on foundations both solid and troubling. The story of New York in the 1600s is a story of transformation, of a landscape remade by human ambition and labor. The island that Henry Hudson first saw in 1609, forested and wild, had by century's end become a thriving port city. The Dutch settlement of New Amsterdam had given way to the English city of New York, yet the transition preserved more than it erased. Languages mixed on the streets. Architectural styles blended. The city that emerged was neither wholly Dutch nor wholly English, but something new. What began as a trading post had evolved into something larger and more permanent. The city had developed institutions, traditions, a civic identity. It had weathered conquest and political upheaval. It had grown beyond its original boundaries. The New York of 1700 was recognizably a city in the modern sense, a concentration of people and commerce and culture that would continue to grow through the centuries to come. The foundations laid in that first century would prove enduring. The city's position as a great port, its role as a commercial crossroads, its cultural diversity, these characteristics established in the 1600s would shape New York's destiny through all its subsequent history. The narrow streets and modest buildings of the 17th century would eventually give way to broader avenues and towering structures, but the essential character forged in those early decades would persist. The New York of the 1600s exists now only in documents and archaeological remnants, in traces left by foundations and artifacts excavated from beneath later development. But the city that grew from those beginnings, that inherited the geography and the commercial orientation and the cultural complexity of the 17th century settlement, remains very much alive. The story of those first decades, of Dutch traders and English conquerors, of enslaved Africans and displaced natives, of merchants and craftsmen building a city at the edge of empire, echoes still in the metropolis that bears the same name. If you enjoyed this journey through history, please like this video and subscribe to The Living Past for more historical reconstructions.